The People's Pharmacy podcast is sponsored by the Brain Gauge, developed by neuroscientists at the University of North Carolina to study brain function across a wide range of applications, including aging and traumatic brain injury.
The Brain Gauge translates state-of-the-art neuroscience into easy-to-use methods that let you take control of your brain health. Now available with a low-cost subscription model for the home. Find out more at gaugeyourbrain.com.
How often does someone ask you to tell them your story? The stories we tell ourselves and others reveal the shape of our lives. This is The People's Pharmacy with Terry and Joe Graydon.
Dr. Rachel Naomi Remen has written 2 wonderful books about stories that can heal. She tells us why stories are so important.
People don't recognize what their real strengths are. They don't recognize purpose. The thing about story, how story differs from fact, is that story contains meaning, and meaning is what changes everything.
A story that undermines us can be changed to one that offers us strength and hope.
Coming up on The People's Pharmacy, Dr. Remen discusses why you should share your stories.
First, this news.
In The People's Pharmacy Health Headlines, the Mediterranean diet has a reputation as a tasty way to cut your risk of heart disease. Previous randomized controlled trials such as the Lyon Diet Heart Study and the PREDIMED study were conducted in Mediterranean countries. So is it possible for Americans to benefit by following a Mediterranean-style eating pattern? Results from the Women's Health Study, published in JAMA Network Open, show that American women who emphasize veggies and fruits, nuts and fish, and downplay meats and sweets get a significant cardiovascular edge. The study included nearly 26,000 women over 45 years old. They answered detailed questionnaires about their diets and gave blood to be analyzed for cholesterol and other markers. Harvard researchers scored the dietary data on a scale from 1 to 9 for adherence to a Mediterranean-style eating pattern. Over about 2 decades, women with scores in the upper third were 28% less likely than those in the lowest third to suffer complications. These included heart attack, stroke, hospitalization for a coronary, or death from cardiovascular causes. They had lower glucose levels and less insulin resistance. Although this was not a randomized controlled trial, it strongly suggests that American women can help their hearts by following a Mediterranean dietary eating style.
If you, like many people, can't face the day without a strong cup of coffee, there's good news. Scientists at Rutgers have evidence that the combination of caffeine with a special fatty acid present in coffee can protect the brain. They studied mice and found that neither caffeine nor the fatty acid EHT alone had much impact. The two combined prevented a buildup of proteins in mouse brains. These proteins are markers for both Parkinson's disease and Lewy body dementia. The scientists caution that they will need to do more research to determine the appropriate doses to help protect humans from these devastating brain diseases.
Nobody wants to be hospitalized during the holidays, if at all possible. Now, a new study suggests that there's a medical reason to avoid hospitalization, if possible. Toronto researchers discovered that people who land in the hospital between Christmas and New Year's are at greater risk than those hospitalized at other times of the year. The investigators found that people discharged from the hospital during this time frame were more likely to die or be readmitted within a relatively short period of time. Perhaps this is because they were less likely to connect with a doctor for their follow-up within a week or 2 of discharge. The differences aren't large, but they are significant. In 100,000 patients, there are 26 more deaths, 188 more rehospitalizations, and 483 more emergency room visits after discharge during the December holidays.
Medical errors are a leading cause of death and disability. Some patient experts estimate that between 250 and 400,000 people die annually because of medical mistakes. One way to reduce such errors is by improving communication between health professionals, patients, and their families. That's the conclusion of a study involving over 3,000 pediatric patients admitted to 7 North American hospitals. The researchers analyzed a patient safety approach that required physicians and nurses to include families and patients in morning rounds. Medical jargon was minimized, and families were encouraged to ask questions and share their worries. At the end of the interaction, the families were supposed to read back their notes of what they learned. As a result of this intervention, serious medical mistakes were reduced by about 40%.
47 states are cooperating in an antitrust lawsuit against 16 generic drug manufacturers. The attorneys general have presented evidence of collusion and price fixing. The suit includes 300 drugs. Executives met to determine which manufacturers would control certain medications and what prices could be charged. Everyone was expected to play nice in this pharmaceutical sandbox. Despite the continued investigation, many generic drug prices remain high. And that's the health news from the People's Pharmacy this week.
Welcome to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Modern medicine prides itself on its science and efficiency. We have sophisticated diagnostic tests and powerful interventions. But sometimes the most important part of any healthcare interaction involves the patient's story.
To learn more about the power of stories, we turn to Dr. Rachel Naomi Remen. She's founder and founding director of the Remen Institute for the Study of Health and Illness at Wright State University Boonshoft School of Medicine in Dayton, Ohio. She's also professor of family medicine at the Boonshoft School of Medicine and clinical professor of family medicine at UCSF School of Medicine, San Francisco, California. Her books include Kitchen Table Wisdom, Stories That Heal, and My Grandfather's Blessings, Stories of Strength, Refuge, and Belonging.
Welcome back to the People's Pharmacy, Dr. Rachel Naomi Remen.
Oh, thank you.
Rachel, you've had a most extraordinary life. You have touched so many people, so many medical students, so many health professionals, and so many patients. Can you tell us why it's important for us, all of us, to share our stories and to learn from the stories of other people? Why is it that stories are so important for all of us?
Well, story is a different kind of information than scientific fact. You know, a good story is like a compass. It points to something that is true, something that can be trusted, something that has been true sometimes for many, many, many years, and invites us to change our direction, to move through our lives a little differently, to own our own power and direction a little more, to overcome barriers and obstacles, and to recognize the deep meaning in our ordinary lives and our relationships, and fill ourselves up with the strength of this meaning. It gives us new eyes. Stories give us new eyes, enable us to make a difference, enable us to recognize the reality around us in a different way. It is complementary to scientific knowledge, but it is older than scientific knowledge. Stories help people to live. They help people to live well. They help people to change old definitions of themselves which are not true, and to move into larger definitions of who they really are. They help us feel blessed. Yeah.
I'd like to ask Rachel about patients telling their stories, because we've been hearing for 20 years that patients go into the room to talk with their doctors and that the doctors interrupt. And I don't think that's gotten any better. Why is it important for patients to tell their stories?
I think it's important for everybody to tell their stories, or at least to know their story and be aware of it. The average doctor has about 10, 12 minutes to deal with a patient these days. There isn't much room for telling stories. Even such dimensions of medicine like hospice, where story was a great big part of this, in terms of people, the professionals talking to each other about their work. Very rarely are stories told anymore. And there is a movement afoot to help people remember their own stories, but they're generally telling these in groups to other people, and not necessarily telling this in the middle of a medical visit when you have 10 minutes to deal with whatever problem you've come to see the doctor about.
Sometimes a story about ourselves, how we think of ourselves, what we've been told by health professionals.
Or somebody else.
Can build us up, can encourage us, or sometimes that story can diminish us. And we believe that story, which may not even be true. They can rob us of our strength. They can rob us of our potential. Can you tell us a little bit about when you were 15 and a doctor told you that you had an incurable disease?
Well, I have Crohn's disease. I'm now 81. And so I've had it for well over 60 years. And when I first became ill, I was told that I would die by the time I was 40, that I could not expect to live a full life or even a normal life. And I believe this. I made many life decisions based on this, decisions about marriage, decisions about having children. And I'm now, as I say, 81. So the story that I was given, the story on which I was basing my track through life, was a flawed story. And the point in that really is that nobody knows their own story until they've lived it. And to define yourself in a certain way may be very, very inaccurate. I know my story much better now at 81 than I ever did when I was 15. There was no way I could know my story at 15. Or who I was as the protagonist in my story. I was told I was a flawed and imperfect person, and I certainly wasn't the person I thought I wanted to be. But I turned out to be a much bigger, stronger, happier person than the person I thought I wanted to be. But you have to live that one out. You can't predict that.
When I was young, Rachel, I had polio, and my doctor at the time told my mother I would never walk again. Mm-hmm. And she refused to believe that story and massaged my legs and helped me exercise, and eventually I was able to walk and play tennis and do all sorts of things that I was told I couldn't do. And yet my mother and my dad, for that matter, believed that I was sick. That is to say that I was vulnerable and weak and that I had to be protected. And I kind of grew up rebelling and resisting that message, and it probably got me into trouble more than once. I'm wondering how we can reshape a story that we are told that's not necessarily serving us well.
Well, I can tell you my own story, which is very similar to yours in a way, Joe, in that I did not know that you had polio. And I just sort of didn't know the role that your mother had played in your becoming the person who you are. and the person who's been able to change the world as much as you have changed the world. My mom also was very helpful to me. I hardly knew her because she was a professional. She was a nurse. And in those days, a nurse was suspect, morally suspect. They were women who saw other people without their clothes on. And this was certainly not the sort of thing that was respected when my mother became a nurse, which was about the turn of the century. And I didn't know her very well because she was always working. But then I got sick, and she sort of came out of the woodwork. It was as if she did not know how to be the parent of a child, but she knew how to help a sick person find their power. And when I stopped becoming her child and became a sick person, a lifetime of her insights were given to me as a total benefit. So I had come home from the hospital. I'd been hospitalized for a very long time when my disease first began. And I lay on the couch, and I'd been told I could not go back to college. I could not go back to school. I could not. My whole life plan was now no longer going to be possible. And I lay on the couch and whined. Yes, so my mother came in one day, having become fed up with my whining, and said to me, "Get up, get dressed, we're going somewhere." And I said, "Where are we going?" And she said, "You'll find out when you get there." We got in her car, and she drove me to the raceway. And she signed me up for racing driving lessons. And I raced Porsches until I was almost 21 years old. And she wanted me to discover something that would change the story I had been told about myself. And that story was I was an invalid. I was going to die by the time I was 40. I couldn't go back to college. I couldn't go to medical school, which had been my plan all along. Basically, that I was going to be an invalid until the time that I died, right? And that would be young. And she wanted to change that story. And she did that by giving me racing lessons. Now, at that time, I'm 5'9", and I must have weighed about 80 pounds when my mother took me off the couch. I couldn't walk 2 blocks. But I could drive a car at 110, 120 miles an hour and win races. And she wanted me to know that even though I couldn't walk 2 blocks at the time, I could move through this world with authority, with direction. I could get where I was going. And this is how she did that. She changed my story. She changed the story that all the medical experts told me about myself and about my disease, and about my future. And that was the beginning of everything, of course.
You're listening to Dr. Rachel Naomi Remen, founder and founding director of the Remen Institute for the Study of Health and Illness at Wright State University Boonshoft School of Medicine in Dayton, Ohio. Her books include Kitchen Table Wisdom, Stories That Heal, and My Grandfather's Blessings, Stories of Strength, Refuge, and Belonging.
After the break, we'll consider how we may have an unsuspected impact on the people around us.
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon.
If you like the information you hear when you listen to The People's Pharmacy, you may also enjoy our book published by National Geographic. It's The People's Pharmacy Quick and Handy Home Remedies, available online at peoplespharmacy.com or at your favorite bookstore.
Welcome back to The People's Pharmacy. I'm Terry Graydon.
And I'm Joe Graydon. If you would like to purchase a CD of this show, you can call 800-732-2334. Today's show is 1146. That number is 800-732-2334, or visit the website. It's peoplespharmacy.com. You can also download the podcast from iTunes.
The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by BrainGauge, developed by neuroscientists at the University of North Carolina to track brain health. Home research and clinical applications available. Home subscription options can be found online at gaugeyourbrain.com.
Today, we are talking about why it's so important to tell your stories. Has anyone ever impacted your life in a powerful way by telling the truth? They may not even have realized what a difference it made for you.
We're talking with Dr. Rachel Naomi Remen. She's founder and founding director of the Remen Institute for the Study of Health and Illness at Wright State University Boonshoft School of Medicine in Dayton, Ohio. She's also professor of family medicine at the Boonshoft School of Medicine and clinical professor of family medicine at UCSF School of Medicine in San Francisco, California. Her books include Kitchen Table Wisdom, Stories That Heal, and My Grandfather's Blessings, Stories of Strength, Refuge, and Belonging.
Rachel, this reminds me of a story you told us many years ago about how each of us can have a profound personal impact on people around us. And we sometimes forget about that or don't even realize our own power. And you told us a story about a woman who was in an abusive relationship, and she went to New York with her husband, and she was at a stoplight at a crosswalk, and she looks across the
Now, are you going to tell me the story?
Yeah,
or
well, I'm going to
you?
ask you to tell us the story because it was such a profound story. It has stayed with me all these years, and I've told it many times myself. So tell us what happened.
Well, first of all, let me back up a little bit. That the first time I read one of my books of stories, and by the way, my books almost didn't get published because they weren't real books. They were just books of little stories, trivia, right? We've learned a lot about storytelling since 1996, let me tell you. But at any rate, so the first time that I gave a book reading in a bookstore, which is one of my favorite things to do, because people tell you their stories, you tell them your stories. It's quite a wonderful experience. The first time I did that, a man stood up and said, I think of you as grandmother spider. And I'm not a great fan of spiders. So I said, what is that? And grandmother spider is apparently a American Indian myth, if you will, that it basically says that the world is connected by an invisible web. And the web gets broken. The connections between people get broken. And until people are not aware that there's a web of connection that connects all of us, one to the other. Right? Grandmother Spider weaves up the broken web of connection between us all. And she does that by telling stories. Right? This is a very important piece of all of this. Most of us have no idea of our power to influence other people, to change their lives, even the lives of total strangers, people whose names we don't even know and will never know. And the story that you were just referring to, Joe, is one of those stories. And it was told to me by a woman who has done a great deal of good service in her life. She's worked with people whose partners have abused them and helped them to free themselves and find a better life for themselves, right? And this is a story that she told me of how she got into this field. I had asked her, because she's a very delicate woman, how she got into this brutal field. And she says, I used to be one of these women. My first husband was an abuser. And he was a pillar of the community. He was a professional, so nobody dreamed her marriage was so abusive, that her life was a living hell. And like most abusers, he told her that the abuse was her own fault because of the stupid things she said and did. And after 7 years of this, she came to believe him, that the abuse was her own fault and that she was a stupid person. And all this ended one day on a street corner in New York City. She and her husband were there visiting, and they were standing on a street corner in New York waiting for the light to change. And she looked across the street and she saw a beautiful building, and she turned to him and she said, "Honey, look at that beautiful building." And he, thinking they were alone, turned to her and said in the tone of utter contempt that he reserved for their private conversations, he said, "Oh, you idiot, you mean that yellow building? The one that's like every other building on the street? You think that's beautiful? You are such an idiot." And she did what she'd been doing when he addressed her in this way for many years. She just fell silent. But a woman who was standing next to them on the street corner, also waiting for the light to change, right, turned to him in disbelief and said to him, "What? That's a perfectly beautiful building. She's absolutely right. And you, sir, are a horse's ass." And then the light changed. And this total stranger walked across the street and went on with the rest of her life. But my friend told me that that was the moment her whole life changed. She suddenly understood what had been happening to her. She understood that she had never deserved the treatment, both physical and emotional, that she had been going through for the past 7 years. And then she felt something very strange. She just said there was almost like a power rose up in me, a strength. I could feel it. And I knew that it was going to take time. It would take planning. But I was going to be able to leave this man. Now, this is not a story about my friend. This is a story about the stranger, the New Yorker. And if we were to somehow go to New York and find her today, I mean, it's 25 years ago. If we could find her today and say to her, "Excuse me, ma'am, have you ever saved anyone's life?" I don't think she'd say, "Yeah, sure, on that street corner, we're waiting for the light to change." I remember that one.
Not very likely she'd even remember it.
I don't think she would say that at all. I think what she'd say is something like this: "What? Change lives? I don't change lives. Do I look like a doctor to you? I don't save lives." We've all blessed many more people than we know. We've all changed the lives of people that we have no idea. And we have not done that necessarily with our skills or our book learning. We've done that with our simple humanity. There's a web of connection between us, and that gives us the power to change the world, actually. So that's the story. That's the story.
Well, you know, Rachel, it's such a powerful story, and it gives us such hope that we can make a difference. But you told another story from your grandfather, as I recall, in My Grandfather's Blessings, in which you describe a situation in which he says, we don't always recognize the blessings around us. And the metaphor that he used was of an airport and the airplanes circling to land. What was he trying to communicate?
Oh, I don't know. I think most likely that we all live a much richer, deeper life than we realize. I don't know. I can't answer that.
Well, I always interpret it as meaning that we are surrounded by blessings and that we sometimes don't realize, don't take the time, don't always appreciate those people around us, the stories that they're sharing, our own stories that make a difference in our lives, sometimes a profound difference. And maybe sometimes we just need to make room for those airplanes to land and see them as the blessings they are.
Well, I must say this, Joe, looking at my own life, sometimes a blessing doesn't look like a blessing when it arrives in your life. Sometimes it looks like a challenge or a loss or a disappointment.
Could you tell us about one time like that, please, Rachel?
Well, I think my whole life is about that. I mean, just the business of getting Crohn's disease and becoming a, quote, invalid.
In what
that
way
didn't look like a blessing.
It certainly did not. In what way has it become a blessing?
I don't think I would have done any of the things that I've done in my life. My whole life plan at that time was to become the first woman head of a department of pediatrics. That was what I was going to do. I had not written one word. I don't think, I hadn't written a word until I was 56 years old. I had no idea, and I never went for a book contract either. It just dropped into my lap. And it took a great deal for me to even accept it. I was about to call and tell them, I don't know how to write. Why are you giving me this thing? But a blessing doesn't always look like a blessing. And what you think of as your strengths often don't turn out to be your strengths. And other things that people have not valued in you may turn out to be the things of the foundation of a good life. I mean, I was always told, certainly as a medical person, that I needed to stop telling these stories, that this was anecdotal evidence. I mean, what's the power of a story? It's not scientific. It only happened to one person. So how could it have any influence or meaning? And I didn't tell stories for years. I was very embarrassed about my storytelling. And then when, I can tell you how the book contract happened, which is very funny. It's another one of these, I think I'm going in one direction and I'm actually going in another direction.
Do tell us.
Well, I don't know about you, but with me, I very rarely have an accurate aim, shall we say. The way it works for me is that life takes me by whatever handle is sticking out and moves me along a very purposeful path, which I'm usually totally unaware of until I look backward over my shoulder. Just in general, this whole thing began for me a long time ago when I was invited to Esalen Institute as one of a dozen doctors to look at some of the ideas that people had there back in 1972. And my opposite number, I was a young professor at Stanford Medical School at the time. My opposite number from the medical department came to see me in the pediatric department and invited me to go with him to this program of weekends, 12 weekends at a place called Esalen Institute. Never heard of it. And examine the ideas about health and illness, which were emerging down there, which were really radical. And I hear the whole story, and I ask about Esalen Institute, and he describes this situation. It's on the cliff overlooking the ocean. There are hot tubs and all kinds of people and, all this stuff going on. It was an absolute hotbed of change, right? And I look at this and I say to myself, what a great way to meet men. And I had just broken up with a boyfriend. So I go to Esalen Institute and I discover a whole new way of thinking about health and illness and human strength and growth and spirituality. But if I had known, and then, after I was there for visiting there once a month for a year, I literally got promoted at Stanford. And the day afterwards, I quit.
Why did you quit?
And because I wanted to develop a medicine that involved healing as well as curing. And that was a radical, radical idea that came directly out of Esalen, right?
Mm-hmm.
And my sense is that had I known that I was going to give up years and years and years of training as a pediatrician, let go of all my dreams of, the power of running a department of medicine, I would never have gone. I would never have gone.
Well, thank goodness you did.
This thing presented itself to me as an opportunity to meet men. And that was the handle that was sticking out at the time. That motivated me. I never met men down there. What I met was my future. But had it been presented like that, I would have said, oh, no, that's not my future. I've been working for years to be the head of the Department of Pediatrics. I'm not letting go of this. Are you kidding? So there is a way that things move you along. And they don't always appear to be what they seem. And as an 81-year-old person, a lot of what I was presented to me as my weaknesses have turned out to be my strengths and the foundation of my life, like storytelling, anecdotal evidence. Stories have not been respected until very, very recently. Much too subjective, much too soft. But they have the power to change everything. If you want to make change, you change the story that people tell each other about whatever it is you want to change. People move with story.
You're listening to Dr. Rachel Naomi Remen, founder and founding director of the Remen Institute for the Study of Health and Illness at Wright State University Boonshoft School of Medicine in Dayton, Ohio. She's professor of family medicine at the Boonshoft School of Medicine and clinical professor of family medicine at UCSF School of Medicine in San Francisco, California. Her books include Kitchen Table Wisdom, Stories That Heal, and My Grandfather's Blessings, Stories of Strength, Refuge, and Belonging. They've been translated into 23 languages. Dr. Remen created a course for medical students called The Healer's Art. Since 1991, it's been taught in more than 100 medical schools.
And Terry, one of the things that's so extraordinary about Dr. Rachel Naomi Remen is that she has focused as much on healing as curing, because healing is ultimately one of the most important things we can do for one another.
Absolutely. And I love the image of her as grandmother spider repairing that relational web.
After the break, Dr. Remen will tell us about the Kabbalah story of Tikkun Olam and her childhood story of the cup of dirt her grandfather gave her.
We find out why you sometimes need patience to figure out what's causing serious symptoms.
You'll also learn about the Commonweal Cancer Help Program and how it focuses on healing rather than curing.
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon.
The People's Pharmacy podcast is sponsored in part by Kaya Biotics. Kaya Biotics offers the first probiotics which are both certified organic and hypoallergenic.
All probiotics are produced in Germany under laboratory conditions with high-quality ingredients and under strict regulatory oversight.
The 3 available formulas are created for very specific purposes, such as strengthening the immune system, fighting yeast infections, and helping with weight loss.
To learn more about Kaya Biotics probiotics and the important topic of gut health, you can visit their website, KayaBiotics.com. That's Kaya Biotics.com. Use the discount code PEOPLE for $10 off your first purchase. Welcome back to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Terry Graydon.
And I'm Joe Graydon. To purchase a CD of today's show or any People's Pharmacy broadcast, you can call 800 800-732-2334. Today's show is 1146. That number again, 800-732-2334, or you can find it at peoplespharmacy.com. You can also download the free podcast from iTunes or from our web store. We invite you to consider writing a review.
The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by BrainGauge, developed by neuroscientists at the University of North Carolina to track brain health. Home, research, and clinical applications available. Home subscription options can be found online. GaugeYourBrain.com.
Today, we're talking about why stories are so crucial to communicating with health professionals. Telling your story is essential to getting the right diagnosis. Sometimes we also need a bit of patience to allow the body to reveal what is going on.
We're talking with Dr. Rachel Naomi Remen. She's founder and founding director of the Remen Institute for the Study of Health and Illness at Wright State University Boonshoft School of Medicine in Dayton, Ohio. She's also professor of family medicine at the Boonshoft School of Medicine and clinical professor of family medicine at UCSF School of Medicine in San Francisco, California. Her books include Kitchen Table Wisdom, Stories That Heal, and My Grandfather's Blessings, Stories of Strength, Refuge, and Belonging.
Rachel, you told us a story many years ago about your grandfather and a little cup of dirt.
Mm-hmm.
Please tell us about this gift and the continuing gifts it's given you as you've reflected on this over the years.
Well, there's a much bigger story involved in that, and I will tell that story, but let me tell the bigger story first. And the bigger story is perhaps one of the most important stories for us at this time. You know, there are such things as wisdom stories, Joe, stories that get passed along for thousands of years sometimes because they help us to live. They give us new eyes. Stories often give us new eyes. You know, the voyage of discovery lies not in seeking new vistas, but in having new eyes, right? And here is one of the oldest stories. It's from Kabbalah, the mystical arm of Judaism from the 14th century, just about. And it's called The Story of the Birthday of the World. And it goes like this. It was also, by the way, told to me by my grandfather, who was a mystic, a Kabbalist, and an Orthodox rabbi, and a remarkable storyteller. And it goes like this. In the beginning, there is only the holy darkness, the Ein Sof. And then, sometime in the history of things, the whole world as we know it, the world that my grandfather referred to as the world of 1,000 things, emerges as a ray of light from the heart of the holy darkness. And then, possibly because this is a Jewish story, the vessels holding the wholeness of the world break open. And the wholeness of the world, the light, is broken up into 1,000 pieces, little tiny sparks of wholeness and light. And they fall into everything. They fall into all people, all events, all institutions, where they remain deeply hidden until this very day. My grandfather told me that this is the reason for the whole human race to come into being. The whole human race is a response to this accident. We are all here because we're able to discover and uncover the hidden wholeness in all life's events, all people, to tend it, strengthen it, lift it up again, make it visible once again, and thereby we can restore the world back to its original wholeness. And this collective task involves everyone. And in Hebrew, the collective task is called tikkun olam, restoring the world back to its original wholeness, healing the world. So according to Kabbalah, we, exactly as we are the healers of the world. And this is where the story that you just referred to comes from. Because when my grandfather told me this, he wanted me to take this personally. That this wasn't just an old story that had been told by thousands of people to thousands of other people. This is a story about me, right? And he came one Sunday after he had told me this story and gave me a little paper cup full of dirt. And I was excited when I saw the cup. I knew it had something magic in it because my grandfather was always so magic. And I couldn't wait to hold it and look in it. And I looked at it. It was full of dirt. And I was the only child of late in life parents. I wasn't allowed to play with dirt. So I told him that. And he laughed. And he took me into the kitchen and showed me how to put a little bit of water into the cup. And told me if I did that every day, I put a little bit of water into this cup on the dirt every day, something could happen. I was thrilled. I was a New York City child. At the time, I lived on the 6th floor of a walk-up. I had no idea what could happen if you put water on dirt. But I loved my grandfather, and I did what he told me. So the first week was okay. Every day I would put a little bit of water in the kitchen, into the cup. But the second week got harder. And the second week, when he came to visit me again, I tried to give the cup back to him. And he wouldn't take it. He wouldn't take the cup back. He said to me, every day, Neshumala, every day. And the third week got to be very hard. I would forget. And I would wake up after I'd been put to bed and remember that I hadn't watered the cup, and I was afraid of the dark, and I would take the cup and I'd go in the dark into the kitchen and put water into it, and then I'd take it back and put it on the windowsill in my room every day. And halfway through the third week, there were 2 little green leaves in the cup that hadn't been there the night before. I was thrilled. I was shocked. I was so surprised. I couldn't wait to see my grandpa because I was sure he was going to be just as surprised as I was. But he wasn't. He wasn't. What he said was, Neshumala, you can change the world. All it needs. And I said, all it needs is water, Grandpa? No, Neshumala, no, Neshumala. All it needs is for you to know that something can happen and take action on that. It's a very important story for now.
Rachel, you told us a story about your life many years ago. You were quite ill, and you went to see one of the best doctors in the Bay Area, and he was not able to help you diagnose what was going on. But he basically said, be patient. It will reveal itself. And eventually it did, and you had surgery and you recovered. I had a somewhat similar story this summer. I had a lot of abdominal pain. It wasn't terrible. It was uncomfortable. It would come, it would go, a little bit like your situation. And then we were on an airplane flying home from San Francisco back to Raleigh-Durham, and the pain had become excruciating. It got so bad that I thought I might have to ask the pilot to land the plane, and that would have been incredibly embarrassing. I've got a bellyache, please land the plane. I didn't think that would go over very well with the other passengers, but the pain was just unbearable. Long story short, I ended up in the emergency room. A wonderful woman saved my life. She's a surgeon, and she removed 10 inches of my small intestine, which had become lodged in my large intestine, which is not a good thing.
Oh, wow.
And so the situation that had persisted for weeks and perhaps a couple of months revealed itself. and the problem was solved. But I suspect a lot of people get very frustrated having to wait for something to reveal itself. How can we learn patience when we live in such a fast-paced world and where medicine is supposed to be revealed quickly through all of our very sophisticated tests?
Well, the world around us teaches us that, you don't grow an apple tree in 5 seconds. You plant a few seeds and you care for them. Everything is a process. Nothing is finished. Everything is in process. Even your pain is in process. And eventually it gets to a place where it is revealed. And then, action can take place. The thing that was very important to me in situations like yours, because sometimes I would have to wait for a number of years before something was revealed, is to not be waiting alone. The doctor who encouraged me to be able to wait basically said to me, we will wait together. In time, this will reveal itself. And when it reveals itself, if there's a surgical solution, I'm going to be there for you. And if there isn't a surgical solution, I will get you to someone who can help. You are not alone. And the aloneness is what weakens us, not the situation itself. It must have been terrifying for you to feel that you were on this airplane and you were, basically alone with something that you experienced that nobody else in the plane knew you were even experiencing. It's very difficult. It's very difficult.
Very, very scary.
Mm-hmm.
We are almost out of time, Rachel, and I want to get to something that you have dedicated many years of your life to, and that is the Commonweal Cancer Help Program. For a lot of people with cancer, there may not be a cure, but there can be healing. Terry and I have had an opportunity to spend time at Commonweal with our dear friend Tom Ferguson. That's when we met you.
Right.
Can you help us understand what you're doing when it comes to healing?
I'd love to be able to read you a story I wrote recently and put on the Commonweal's newest website, Beyond Conventional Cancer Therapies. And it's about a person who underwent healing in the setting of cancer. And it's called Let There Be Light. In the process of recovering from kidney cancer, one of my newer patients underwent a transformation from a hard-driving CEO to a volunteer and supporter of many good causes. After a few sessions, he told me about the experience that had changed his way of moving through the world. As a child of atheistic and intellectual parents, he had no religious upbringing or spiritual inclination, and had immersed himself for many years in the world of competition and business with much success. While formerly his business had been the focus of his life, now his cancer and its treatment required him to be away from the multitasking demands and pressures of his work, and instead to spend several months in the quiet of his living room. At first, this had been frightening and deeply disorienting. But then, as the fatigue of his chemotherapy took hold, he had simply surrendered to the silence and spent hours on his couch, dozing in the company of his cat. One afternoon, as he lay drifting in and out of sleep, he found himself looking at a bookshelf on the opposite wall. And it seemed to him that one of the books stood out from the others in an odd way. Getting up for a closer look, he saw it was the Bible that the clergy who had performed his marriage years ago had given to him and his wife. Taking it back to the couch, he opened it for the first time and began to read the story of the beginning of the world. He was surprised to feel a deep response to the simple words. How real and familiar and terrifying the formlessness and the darkness felt to him, and how it seemed to be somehow connected to the terrible recent events in his own life. And then he encountered for the first time the statement with which the world begins, "Let there be light." He lay there for a time, feeling the great power in these 4 words wash over him. As he ruminated about this, the words suddenly shifted their meaning, and he realized that they were addressed to him personally, that he personally was able to choose to act in ways that increased the light in the world. He had never considered this possibility before, but over the next days and weeks it became more and more compelling a thought, until he recognized it as a deep yearning to live in a certain way, a different way, that perhaps the purpose of life was not to become wealthy or succeed in business or even to leave a large financial inheritance to his children as he had thought. Perhaps his life was being given back to him so he might have a chance to fulfill its real purpose and bring more light into the world. Perhaps this was the inheritance that he could leave to his children. Life-threatening illness of any sort transforms us. It doesn't make us smaller. Often it shows us in a clear mirror who we really are, what matters, what's important. And that's my experience of working with people with cancer. Cancer has made people strong many, many times, made them part of the solution rather than part of the problem.
Dr. Rachel Naomi Remen, thank you so much for sharing your stories with us today.
Oh, Terry, as always, what an honor to talk with you and Joe and be part of the wonderful work that you and he are doing together in this world. Thank you for asking me.
You've been listening to Dr. Rachel Naomi Remen, founder and founding director of the Remen Institute for the Study of Health and Illness at Wright State University Boonshoft School of Medicine in Dayton, Ohio. She's professor of family medicine at the Boonshoft School of Medicine and clinical professor of family medicine at UCSF School of Medicine in San Francisco, California. Her extraordinary books include Kitchen Table Wisdom, Stories That Heal, and My Grandfather's Blessings, Stories of Strength, Refuge, and Belonging. They've been translated into 23 languages. Dr. Remen created a course for medical students called The Healer's Art. Since 1991, it's been taught in more than 100 medical schools.
Lynn Siegel produced today's show. Al Wodarski engineered. Dave Grayton edits our interviews.
The People's Pharmacy is produced at the studios of North Carolina Public Radio, WUNC.
The People's Pharmacy theme music is by B.J. Liederman.
To buy a CD of today's show or any other People's Pharmacy broadcast, you can call 800-732-2334. Today's show is 1146. That's 800-732-2334 online at peoplespharmacy.com.
When you visit our site, you can share your thoughts about our conversation with Dr. Rachel Naomi Remen. Please tell your story about healing in the comments section for today's show.
In Durham, North Carolina, I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Thank you for listening. Join us again next week.
We hope you enjoyed this podcast. If so, please consider taking a minute to write a review on iTunes. And thanks for listening to The People's Pharmacy.